She wasn't looking for the truth. She was only looking for her mother's reading glasses. But the drawer gave her something else entirely, a letter addressed to a man she had never heard of. And her mother had been dead for exactly 11 days. That single envelope, sitting quietly beneath a pair of bent gold reading glasses and a worn leather Bible, would not just answer questions Elena never knew she had. It would tear open 40 years of silence and force her to look at every single memory she had of her mother, every Sunday dinner, every bedtime story, every whispered prayer, and ask herself one terrifying question: had she ever really known the woman who raised her at all? This is not a story about betrayal. This is not a story about a perfect woman who turned out to be something darker underneath. This is a story about love, the kind that gets buried alive, the kind that survives decades of silence, the kind that a mother carries alone in the dark so that her children never have to feel the weight of it. And it is a story about a daughter who found that weight in a drawer on a Tuesday night and made the choice to carry it anyway. Before we go any further, before we follow Elena into the words that changed everything, take a moment right now and let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And if you are new here, hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming stories. Because on this channel, every story we tell is the kind that stays with you long after the screen goes dark. Elena Vasquez was 39 years old when her mother, Margaret Vasquez, passed away quietly in her sleep on a Thursday night in October. The hospice nurse had called at 2:14 in the morning. Elena had been awake already. She had not slept properly in weeks, not since her mother's breathing had started to change, not since the doctor had sat across from her in that small beige office and used the word days instead of weeks. She had driven to her mother's house in Sacramento, California in the dark, in the rain, with the radio off because no song in the world felt appropriate for that particular drive. And when she walked into the bedroom and saw her mother lying there, still, finally still, after months of struggle, she had sat down in the chair beside the bed and held Margaret's hand and stayed there until the sky outside the window went from black to gray to the particular shade of pale gold that means morning is arriving whether you asked for it or not. Margaret Vasquez had been 67 years old. She had lived in the same house in Sacramento for 38 years. She had raised 3 children, Elena, the eldest, then her brother Daniel, then her youngest sister Sophie, largely on her own after their father, Robert Vasquez, died of a heart attack when Elena was just 14 years old. She had worked as a school librarian for 26 years. She had made tamales every Christmas, kept a vegetable garden in the backyard that she tended with the focused dedication of someone who believed deeply that watching things grow was one of the most important things a person could do with their time. She had been, by every measure that the people around her could see, an ordinary woman living an ordinary life with extraordinary love poured into every corner of it. Her neighbors remembered her as the kind of person who always knew your name and always asked how your mother was doing. Her co-workers remembered her as the one who stayed late, who remembered every child's favorite book, who cried every single June when the 5th graders left the elementary school for the last time because she would miss them and she was never ashamed to say so. Her children remembered her as the fixed point of their entire universe, the person who was simply always there, always warm, always certain, the way the sun is certain. Nobody who knew Margaret Vasquez would have described her as a woman with secrets. That is the part that matters most, and it is the part that makes what Elena found in that drawer so completely impossible to prepare for. Because the secrets that undo us are never kept by the people we expect. They are kept by the ones we trust the most completely, by the ones who love us so well and so consistently that we stop looking for the places they might be hiding something. We stop looking because we cannot imagine there is anything to find. We stop looking because we are too busy being held. The 11 days after Margaret's death passed the way grief always passes in the beginning, in fragments. There were phone calls to make and flowers to receive and a funeral to arrange and a reception to host and casseroles arriving at the front door from neighbors who didn't know what else to do with their sadness. Elena's brother Daniel flew in from Chicago and stayed for 4 days, long enough to help carry the coffin and shake hands with the pastor and eat a plate of food he didn't taste, and then he flew back because he had meetings and children and a life that did not stop moving just because their mother had. Her sister Sophie came from Portland and cried so openly and so continuously that Elena spent most of those first days managing Sophie's grief alongside her own, which meant she didn't really manage her own at all. She tucked it somewhere practical inside herself, behind the lists and the phone calls and the logistics, and she told herself she would get to it later. That is what eldest children do. That is what Elena had always done. She was the one who held things together. She had been doing it since she was 14 years old and her father died and her mother had sat at the kitchen table for 3 days straight and Elena had made sandwiches for Daniel and Sophie without being asked because someone had to. When Daniel and Sophie left, the house went quiet in a way that felt different from ordinary quiet. It was the quiet of a place that was waiting. Elena stayed. She had taken a leave of absence from her job as a social worker in San Francisco, and she had told herself she was staying to sort through her mother's belongings, to handle the estate, to do the practical things that needed to be done. But the truth, which she would only admit to herself much later, was that she was not ready to leave. She was not ready to close the door on this house that smelled like her mother, that held 38 years of Margaret Vasquez in every corner and every drawer and every slightly crooked picture frame. Leaving felt like a second loss. Leaving felt like agreeing that it was really over. So she stayed, and she slept in her childhood bedroom, and every morning she woke up and heard the absence of her mother's sounds, no coffee percolating, no radio playing softly in the kitchen, no footsteps on the hardwood floor. And she had to learn all over again, the way grief makes you do, that the person was gone. On the 11th night, she was looking for her mother's reading glasses. It was a practical errand with a practical reason. She had found a stack of documents in the kitchen that needed to be reviewed, insurance papers and a bank statement and something from the county assessor's office, and she thought it would feel right somehow to read them wearing Margaret's glasses. She cannot fully explain why. Grief moves you toward objects belonging to the person you have lost. It makes you want to wear their cardigan, use their mug, sit in their specific chair in the specific way they sat in it. It is the body's way of trying to stay close to someone the mind already knows is gone. She had seen her mother's glasses on the kitchen counter and on the dining room table and on the arm of the sofa for 30 years. She could not find them anywhere that night. She went through the kitchen, the living room, the bathroom. She stood in the doorway of Margaret's bedroom for a long moment, the way she always had to stand in doorways for a long moment before entering, because this room in particular still held her mother so completely that walking into it felt like walking into a place that did not entirely belong to the living. She crossed the room to the nightstand and opened the small drawer beside the bed. Her mother had always kept that drawer locked. Elena had known this her entire life without ever questioning it, the way children accept the rules of their parents' houses as natural law. There was always a small brass key on her mother's keyring, and when Elena was a child she had once asked what it was for, and Margaret had said simply, "It's for my private drawer, sweetheart," and that had been the end of it. But the drawer was not locked that night. Elena pulled it open and it slid open easily, and she understood immediately, with the particular understanding that comes without words, that her mother had left it that way on purpose. The reading glasses were there, folded neatly beside a rosary and a small photograph turned face down. And underneath everything, beneath the glasses and the rosary and the photograph, was an envelope. Cream-colored, aged at the corners, the paper soft with age in the way that paper gets when it has been held many times over many years. Elena picked it up. She turned it over. And there, in her mother's unmistakable handwriting, that slanted cursive that had signed every birthday card and permission slip and school lunch note of Elena's entire childhood, were the words that would change everything she thought she knew. The envelope read, "For Thomas Calloway, if I never find the courage." Elena did not know anyone named Thomas Calloway. She had never in her 39 years heard her mother say that name. Not once. She stood in the middle of her dead mother's bedroom holding an envelope addressed to a stranger in her mother's handwriting, and she felt something shift in the floor beneath her feet, not physically, but in the way that the ground of your entire life can shift when something you thought was solid turns out to be built on top of a story you were never told. She sat down on the edge of her mother's bed. She sat there for a long time without opening the envelope. She turned it over in her hands, feeling the weight of it. It was heavier than a single sheet, there were multiple pages inside, she could tell, and she looked at the name written on the front and she tried to place it somewhere in the geography of her mother's life. She went through Margaret's friends, her co-workers, the men from church, the neighbors who had come and gone over 38 years. Thomas Calloway. Nothing. The name had no address in any map of her mother's world that Elena had ever been given access to. And that absence, that complete blankness, was more unsettling than any name she might have recognized. Because a name you recognize can be explained. A name that exists nowhere in the known world of the person you loved most means there is a part of that person's world you were never shown. She thought about putting it back. Her hand actually moved toward the drawer. She thought about what her sister Sophie would say. Some things are private, Elena, even after. She would say it in that gentle way Sophie had of making reasonable statements sound like prayers. She thought about what her brother Daniel would say. Just leave it alone. He would say it in that direct way Daniel had of cutting through everything to the most practical conclusion. She thought about what her mother would say. And then she stopped thinking, because she understood that her mother had left this drawer unlocked. Not by accident. Margaret Vasquez had been a meticulous woman who kept her keys on a hook by the door and her bills in alphabetical order by due date and her spices arranged by height on a shelf that she dusted every Saturday morning. Margaret Vasquez did not forget to lock things. If the drawer was open because Margaret had decided, somewhere in the last weeks of her life, that the time for locking had finally passed. Elena opened the envelope at 11:30 at night with the bedside lamp casting a small pool of warm light over her mother's quilt, and she began to read. The letter was 5 pages long. It was written in blue ink, in her mother's careful cursive, and it was dated March 14, 2019, 4 years before Margaret's death, which meant she had written it and kept it and not sent it for 4 years. The first line read, "Thomas, I have started this letter 11 times in 11 years and this is the furthest I have ever gotten, so I am going to keep writing until it is done." Elena read that sentence twice. Then she read the whole letter once without stopping, the way you have to read something devastating in its entirety before you can go back and sit with the individual pieces of it. When she finished the last page, she set the papers down on the quilt beside her very carefully, the way you set down something that might break. Then she sat in the silence of her mother's bedroom and she breathed. In and out. In and out. The way you breathe when the air around you has changed and your body needs a moment to adjust to the new atmosphere. The letter told a story Elena had never been given. It told the story of a woman named Margaret and Holloway, not yet Vasquez, not yet anyone's mother, who had arrived at California State University Sacramento in the fall of 1979 as a 21-year-old from a small town in the Central Valley. Her family was working class and deeply religious, and they had sent her to university with 2 pieces of advice: study hard and come home the same way you left. She had every intention of doing exactly that. She was practical and focused and she had chosen her major, library science, with the same deliberate care she brought to everything, because she loved books and she believed that putting the right book into the right person's hands at the right moment was one of the most genuinely useful things a human being could do with their life. She was not looking for anything else. She was not looking for Thomas Calloway. She found him in the university library in October of 1979, which she described in the letter as one of the quietest jokes the universe had ever told at her expense, given that the library was the one place she felt most completely herself and therefore the one place she was most completely unprepared to meet someone who would rearrange her entirely. He was sitting at a table near the window with 3 textbooks open and none of them being read, because he was looking out at the courtyard where the autumn light was coming through the oak trees in a way that clearly had his full attention. She had gone to reshelve a cart of books in that section and he had looked up from the window when she passed and said, without any preamble at all, "Do you ever think about the fact that the light through those trees looks exactly like it did 1,000 years ago and will look exactly like this 1,000 years from now, and we just happen to be the ones sitting here today?" She had looked at him and then looked out the window and then looked back at him. And she had said, "I think about that all the time, actually." And that, Margaret wrote, was the moment she understood that she was in serious trouble. Thomas Calloway was 23 years old and studying architecture. He had grown up in Portland, Oregon, the son of a carpenter and a schoolteacher, and he had come to Sacramento on a partial scholarship with a second-hand drafting set and a quiet, unshakable conviction that the most important thing a person could build was something that made other people feel at home. He had dark hair and kind eyes and he laughed at his own jokes approximately half a second before he finished telling them, which Margaret found both slightly ridiculous and completely disarming. He was the kind of person who remembered things, not just facts, but the specific details that told you he had been paying attention. He remembered that she had mentioned, in passing, on their second conversation, that her grandmother had a rose garden, and 3 weeks later he brought her a paperback about the history of rose cultivation in California, not as a romantic gesture exactly, just as I saw this and thought of what you said gesture, and Margaret wrote that it was perhaps that more than anything else that told her who he was. He was someone who listened. Fully, actually listened. In a world full of people waiting for their turn to speak, Thomas Calloway was someone who heard you and then held what you said with care. They spent the better part of 2 years becoming indispensable to each other. They studied together 4 evenings a week. They drove out to the Delta on weekends and walked along the levees in the cold November air and talked about everything, about books and buildings and family and faith and what they wanted their lives to look like and what they were afraid of and what they believed about the world. He took her to see her first piece of modern architecture, a building in San Francisco that she privately found slightly cold and impractical, which she told him, and he laughed for approximately 45 seconds straight, because he loved that she had opinions and wasn't afraid of them. She read to him from her favorite novels in the evenings and he made sketches in the margins of his notebooks of buildings inspired by the things she read, not literal interpretations. Just the feeling of them, he said, the feeling of the words made into space and light and structure. She kept those notebooks. She kept everything he gave her. She kept his letters, because he wrote letters too, handwritten on heavy cream paper, the same kind of person who believed that a physical letter was a different kind of gift from a phone call, a different kind of permanence. She kept them in a shoebox under her dormitory bed and later, much later, she moved them to a drawer. Margaret wrote about Thomas Calloway in her letter the way people write about the people who shaped them before life stepped in and did its shaping too, with a tenderness that had not been diminished by time, with a specificity that told you she had kept every detail preserved and protected somewhere inside herself the way a museum keeps its most important things, behind glass, in controlled conditions, so that nothing fades. She wrote that she had never told her children about him because she did not know how to explain someone who had mattered that much without making it sound like an accusation against the life she had built, and the life she had built was a good life, a life she loved, a life she had chosen. She had loved Robert Vasquez. She wanted Elena to know that first and clearly and without any ambiguity. She had loved him with her whole heart for the 23 years they had together before his heart gave out and took him with it, and she had been genuinely, completely happy. But Thomas had been the one who came first. And first love, she wrote, is not better than the love that comes after. It is simply different. It is the one that teaches you what love is before you know what to do with the lesson. It is the one that shows you the shape of the room before you understand what you are meant to build inside it. They had planned a future together. Not in the breathless, impractical way of people who are confusing infatuation with something sturdier. They had planned it the way Thomas did everything, carefully and with attention to the specific details that told you the plan was real. They had talked about the city they would settle in and the apartment they would look for and the kind of work they would each do and the way they would build a life that had room in it for her books and his buildings and the long conversations they both needed the way other people needed sleep. She had been certain. She wrote that she had been more certain about that future than she had been about almost anything else in her life before or since. And then the summer of 1981 arrived. And Thomas took a job offer. And the job was in Boston. And Margaret's mother got sick. And everything that had been certain became uncertain almost overnight, in the way that life has of rearranging itself around you when you are too busy making plans to notice it happening. She didn't go to Boston with him. She has never been able to fully explain why, not in the letter and, Elena suspected, not to herself. Her mother was sick and she was needed at home and the job in Boston was a real opportunity and they both told each other it was temporary, it was just for a year, they would write and call and visit and figure it out. And for a while they did. There were letters, long, frequent letters, and phone calls on Sunday evenings and a visit at Christmas that Margaret wrote about in 3 full paragraphs as the happiest 10 days of her adult life. But distance does what distance does. The letters came less frequently. The phone calls got shorter. The visit the following Christmas fell through because Thomas's project ran over schedule and Margaret's mother had taken a turn and there was never a right moment that they could both agree on. And then there was a gap of 4 months without a letter. And then a gap of 6 months. And then Margaret met Robert Vasquez at her cousin's wedding in the spring of 1983 and he asked her to dance and she said yes. She married Robert in June of 1984. She wrote that she had been happy at her wedding. She wrote it twice, as if she understood that the person reading this might need the confirmation. She had been happy. She had chosen Robert with her eyes open, with genuine love, with the full knowledge that she was building something real and permanent and good. She had not married him as a consolation. She had married him because he was worth marrying, because he was kind and steady and present in the way that Thomas, across 3,000 miles, had not been able to be. She had written to Thomas once, after the engagement, a short letter that said only that she hoped he was well and that she was getting married and that she wished him every happiness. He had not written back. And she had understood that this was his way of drawing a clean line, and she had respected it, and she had moved forward, and she had not looked back. Not outwardly. Not in any way that the people around her could see. But in the letter she wrote to him 4 years before her death, Margaret confessed something that she had never said out loud to another living person. She wrote that for the entirety of her marriage to Robert, 23 years, a good marriage, a real marriage, a marriage she was proud of, she had thought about Thomas Calloway on his birthday every single year. She knew his birthday because she had known everything about him once. October 9th. Every year on October 9th, she had lit a candle, quietly, privately, not as a ritual anyone else was aware of, just as a small and personal acknowledgement to herself and to whatever part of the universe was listening, and she had held him in her mind for exactly as long as it took the candle to burn down, and then she had gone back to her life. She did not write this as a confession of unhappiness. She wrote it as a testimony to the specific way of first love lives inside you, not as longing exactly, not as regret exactly, but as a presence. A quiet, permanent presence that does not compete with the life you have built but simply exists alongside it, the way a scar exists alongside healthy skin, not ruining anything, just marking the place where something once happened that was real. Elena read that part 3 times. She sat in her mother's bedroom at midnight and she read it 3 times, and then she looked up at the ceiling and she thought about every October 9th of her entire childhood. She tried to remember if she had ever noticed a candle. She tried to remember if her mother had ever seemed different on that day, more distant, more interior, more present with something that Elena hadn't been able to name. She could not remember. Of course she could not remember. She had not known to look. That is the particular cruelty of secrets, they hide in plain sight, in the ordinary texture of every day, and because you have not been told to look for them, you don't. You look at your mother lighting a candle and you think she is being decorative or atmospheric, and you do not think that she is marking the birthday of the man she loved before she knew you existed. The last 2 pages of the letter were the ones that stopped Elena completely. She had been reading with a kind of controlled steadiness, the way you read something difficult by staying in the words themselves and not letting yourself look up at the implications, but the last 2 pages she could not get through without stopping twice. The first time she stopped was at the paragraph where Margaret wrote about the night Elena was born. She wrote that when the nurse had placed Elena in her arms for the first time, the first coherent thought she had had, after the overwhelming, obliterating love that arrived with the weight of her daughter in her arms, was that she wanted Thomas to know. She had wanted, in that first moment of new motherhood, to find a phone and call him and say something impossible and wonderful has happened and I needed you to know. She had not done it. She had looked at Robert's face instead, at the joy on his face, and she had understood with complete clarity where she was and who she was and what this life was, and she had let the impulse pass. But she had written it down now, 38 years later, because she was dying and she believed that the truth deserved to exist somewhere, even if only on paper, even if no one ever read it. The second time Elena stopped was at the final paragraph. She stopped because the final paragraph contained a question. Not a rhetorical question, a real one, directed outward, directed into the unknown future in which Margaret apparently understood, on some level, that someone might eventually read these words. The question was this: I wonder sometimes, Thomas, if you ever think about what we might have built together, if the timing had been different, if the distance hadn't done what distance does, if I had gotten on a plane to Boston in the summer of 1981 the way part of me wanted to and never looked back. I wonder if the building we would have made of our lives together would have had high ceilings and good light the way you always said was the most important thing. I think it would have. I think we would have made something with very good light. Elena set the letter down on the quilt. She pressed both hands flat against the fabric of her mother's bed. She breathed. And then, very quietly, in the dark bedroom of her mother's house, she began to cry in a way she had not cried once in the 11 days since Margaret had died, not for the loss of her mother, but for the life inside her mother's life that she had never known was there. She did not sleep that night. She sat at her mother's writing desk, the small oak desk by the window where Margaret had paid bills and written Christmas cards and signed school forms for 25 years, and she read the letter a second time from the beginning. Slower this time. The way you read something the second time, looking not just at what it says but at everything around what it says, the spaces between the lines where the unsaid things live. She was looking for Thomas Calloway in the margins of everything she knew about her mother. She was going back through 39 years of her own life and looking at them through this new lens and finding, to her amazement and her grief, that the view was different. Not worse. Not a betrayal of anything she had believed. Just larger. Her mother was larger than she had known. The interior of Margaret Vasquez's life was larger than the version Elena had been given, and that largeness did not diminish the love, it deepened it. Because the woman who had carried this quietly, who had lit a candle every October 9th and then folded herself back into the life she had chosen without asking for sympathy or acknowledgement, who had loved her children with everything she had and kept her private grief as something that belonged to her alone and not to them, that woman was not smaller than the mother Elena had known. She was bigger. She had been bigger all along. At 2 a.m, Elena called her Aunt Ruth. Ruth was Margaret's older sister, 69 years old, retired and living in Fresno, and Elena knew, with the instinct of someone who has grown up around family silences and learned to read them, that if anyone knew about Thomas Calloway, it was Ruth. Ruth answered on the second ring. Elena would think about that later, the second ring, not the fourth or fifth ring of someone startled from sleep, but the second ring, which meant Ruth had either been awake or had been sleeping lightly in the way people sleep when they are waiting for something. Elena, Ruth said. Just the name. No hello, no it's late, sweetheart. Just the name, spoken in a tone that was careful and flat in a way that told Elena everything before she had asked anything. Aunt Ruth, Elena said. Who is Thomas Calloway? The silence on the other end of the phone was long enough that Elena began to count. She got to 9 before Ruth said, in a voice that had changed entirely, softer, older, almost relieved, "Where did you find that name?" And Elena said, "In the drawer beside her bed." And Ruth said, "She left it open, didn't she?" It was not a question. Ruth talked for 2 hours. She talked the way people talk when they have been holding something for a very long time and someone has finally given them permission to set it down. She told Elena about Thomas Calloway the way a person tells a story they have been carrying privately, with detail, with feeling, with the particular tenderness of someone who had watched something beautiful from close range and had never been allowed to describe it out loud. She confirmed everything in the letter. She added things the letter had not contained. She told Elena that she had met Thomas twice, once when he came to visit Margaret during the summer before his move to Boston, and once, briefly, at a mutual friends gathering in Sacramento in the late 1980s, after both of them had moved on into other lives, when he and Margaret had been in the same room for the first and last time since their separation and neither of them had said a single word to the other that Ruth could hear, but she had watched their faces across that room and she had understood what she was looking at. She told Elena that Margaret had loved Robert truly and completely and that their marriage had been real and good and that Ruth had never, not once, worried that Margaret was unhappy or unfulfilled or wishing for a different life. But she also told her that some loves do not end when relationships end. That some connections are built at such a foundational level of a person's self that they become part of the architecture, not the house you live in, but the ground it is built on. Your mother chose her life, Ruth told Elena, in the dark of 2 a.m, from 3 hours south in Fresno. She chose it every single day, and she was glad of her choices, and she loved you and Daniel and Sophie and your father with everything she had. That is the whole truth. But Thomas was real too. He was real first. And your mother was a woman who understood that real things leave marks. She didn't try to pretend otherwise. She just kept it private. She kept it hers. Elena sat at the oak writing desk and listened and held the phone with both hands. When Ruth finally went quiet, Elena asked one more question. She asked if Thomas Calloway was still alive. Ruth said she believed he was. She said he had gone to Boston and built a career and a life there, that she had heard through old mutual friends that he had married in the late 1980s and had children, that he had eventually become something of a respected architect in the Northeast. She said she did not have contact information for him. She said, very gently, that Elena would have to decide for herself what she wanted to do with any of this. After she hung up, Elena made herself a cup of tea in her mother's kitchen, using her mother's kettle, her mother's mug, her mother's brand of chamomile, because grief makes you reach for the objects of the people you have lost, and she sat at the kitchen table in the dark and she thought. She thought about a 21-year-old woman arriving at a university in Sacramento in 1979 with big ideas and a love of books and no awareness at all of what or who was waiting for her in the library by the window. She thought about the way love arrives, not announced, not scheduled, just suddenly present, the way light is suddenly present when someone opens a door. She thought about the particular cruelty of timing, of distance, of the way the world requires us to make permanent decisions with temporary information, the way we are asked to choose our lives before we know all the things that will make us wish we had chosen differently, or, just as often, confirm that we chose correctly. She found him on the internet on the third day after reading the letter. She had told herself she was not going to look. She had told herself this firmly and repeatedly over 2 days, during which she had sorted through her mother's clothes and donated 3 bags to the church thrift store and organized the kitchen and called the estate attorney and done all the practical things that needed doing, and she had kept the letter in the inside pocket of her jacket, close, near, against her body the way you keep things you are not ready to put down. She had thought about Thomas Calloway while she was sorting her mother's cardigans. She had thought about him while she was rinsing dishes. She had thought about him in the specific involuntary way you think about something when your mind is trying to tell you that there is unfinished business it intends to attend to with or without your cooperation. On the third day, she sat down with her laptop at her mother's kitchen table and she typed his name into a search engine and she pressed enter before she had time to decide against it. Thomas Calloway, architect, Boston, Massachusetts. He was not difficult to find. He had a professional website, clean, minimal, the way she imagined an architect's website would look, white space and good photographs and a portfolio of buildings that had clearly been made by someone who cared deeply about the relationship between light and structure. He was 67 years old. His biography was brief and professional, degrees from Harvard, 30 years of practice, a focus on residential and community buildings, a teaching position at a Boston architecture school he had retired from 3 years prior. There was a photograph on the About page. A professional headshot, the kind taken against a neutral background with controlled lighting. A man with gray hair and the kind of face that had clearly once been striking and had aged into something quieter and more substantial. Elena looked at that photograph for a long time. She looked at it the way you look at a stranger you are trying to understand. She thought about her mother at 21, standing in the library with a cart of books, and she thought about this man at 23, looking at a window at the light through the oak trees. She thought about what it meant that her mother had loved this specific person, this face, this man, for long enough to light a candle for him every year for the rest of her life. She thought about sending him a message. The idea arrived fully formed and terrifying in equal measure. What would she even say? She practiced it in her head. Dear Mr. Calloway, my name is Elena Vasquez, my mother was Margaret Holloway, I found a letter she wrote you and never sent, I thought you should know she never forgot you, and each version felt simultaneously too much and not enough. She did not know what she wanted from a conversation with this man. She did not know if she wanted anything. She did not know if contacting him would be a gift or an intrusion or something in between that didn't have a name yet. She closed the laptop and went to bed. She opened it again at midnight and looked at his website again and read his biography twice more. She closed it again. She lay in her childhood bedroom and stared at the ceiling and thought about the fact that this man was alive, somewhere in Boston, and he did not know that the woman who had loved him first had died 11 days ago and had been keeping a letter for him for 4 years. She thought about what it means to be loved without knowing it. She thought about the years of Thomas Calloway's life that had passed while Margaret was lighting a candle on his birthday, the meetings he had taken, the buildings he had designed, the October 9 ths he had lived through without any awareness that somewhere in Sacramento a woman was holding a flame for him in her kitchen in the quiet. She thought about whether that knowledge would comfort him or break something in him that had been safely closed for a long time. She thought about her mother's last line, "Be braver than I was," and she recognized that her mother had not written that to Thomas. She had written it to herself, a private instruction from the version of herself who was dying to the version of herself who had spent decades folding her bravest feelings back into a drawer and locking them away. But Elena had found it. And it felt, in the particular way that meaningful things feel, like it was also meant for her. On the 5th day, she wrote a letter. Not an email. She started it as an email and then she stopped and she got out a piece of paper and a pen and she wrote it by hand, because she understood, having read her mother's letter, that there are things that belong on paper and this was one of them. She wrote slowly, with great care, the way you write something when you know that the words will land on a real person with a real life and a real history and the weight of them matters. She did not write much. She wrote 3 paragraphs. She told him her name and that her mother had been Margaret Holloway and that Margaret had passed away 2 weeks ago. She told him she had found a letter in a drawer beside her mother's bed, addressed to him, written 4 years ago and never sent. She told him she thought he deserved to know it had existed, that his name had been kept carefully, that his memory had been treated with love and respect across 40 years of another life. She told him she would understand completely if he did not wish to respond. She gave him her email address. She folded the letter in thirds and put it in an envelope and she addressed it to the architecture firm listed on his professional website and she drove to the post office and she sent it before she could reconsider. She went back to San Francisco. She went back to her apartment and her routines and the gradual, uneven, nonlinear work of grieving that doesn't stop just because the logistics have been handled and the house has been sorted and the estate attorney has been called. She went back to the version of her life that existed before the drawer, except that she was not the same person who had left it, and the version of her life that existed before the drawer was therefore not exactly available to her anymore. She had been changed by the letter in the way that real knowledge changes you, not dramatically, not all at once, but in the deep and permanent way of something that has been added to your understanding of the world and cannot be removed. She knew something now about the interior life of love that she had not known before. She knew that the person closest to you can be carrying something vast and private and fully alive inside them and you can love them every day for your entire life and never see it because they have made the choice, out of love, out of protection, out of some combination of privacy and sacrifice that you may never fully understand, to keep it theirs. She told her sister Sophie about the letter 2 weeks after she got back to San Francisco. She told her on the phone, carefully, going through it piece by piece, and Sophie was quiet in the way that Sophie was sometimes quiet, a full, attending quiet, not an empty one. When Elena finished, Sophie said, "She was so private." And then, after a pause, "I think I always knew there was something she kept for herself. I didn't know what it was. But you know how sometimes you can tell that a person has a room inside them that they don't take you into? Mom had that. I always thought it was just, I don't know. I thought it was just the part of her that belonged to herself. I didn't know it had a name." Elena thought about that, the idea of a room inside a person, a private interior space that belongs entirely to them and not to anyone who loves them. She thought it was, in its way, one of the most human things Sophie had ever said. We are all, each of us, larger on the inside than anyone who loves us can fully see. That is not a failure of love. That is simply what it is to be a person. She did not hear from Thomas Calloway for 3 weeks. She had not truly expected to hear from him at all. She had sent the letter as a form of completion, she told herself, as a way of honoring her mother's unfinished gesture, not because she was expecting a conversation on the other end of it. But she had checked her email more frequently than usual in those 3 weeks, and she had noticed herself doing it and had quietly judged herself for it, and had checked again anyway. The reply came on a Tuesday afternoon in November, 6 weeks after she had found the letter in the drawer. She was at her desk at work when it arrived and she saw his name in her inbox, and she stood up from her desk immediately and walked to the hallway and stood against the wall and read it on her phone with both hands gripping the screen. The email was not long. It was 3 paragraphs written in the precise, careful way of someone who has chosen every word with full awareness of its weight. He said that he had received her letter and that he had needed several days before he was able to respond because he had not trusted himself to respond well immediately. He said that Margaret's name arriving in his mailbox after 40 years was something he did not have adequate language for, that it had been like a door opening in a wall he had believed was solid. He said that he had thought of her many times over the decades, that he had heard through old friends that she had married and had children and was well, and that this news had been, each time he received it, genuinely good news, the kind you receive about someone you loved well enough to want their happiness even when it is a happiness that does not include you. He said that learning of her death had hit him in a way he had not expected, a grief for someone he had not spoken to in 40 years, which he wrote felt strange and real simultaneously, the way certain griefs do. He said he was sorry for Elena's loss. He said he was sorry in the particular way of someone who understands that the person being mourned was many things to many people and that Elena's version of the loss was entirely her own and not his to claim. And then, at the end of the 3rd paragraph, he wrote one sentence that Elena read 4 times standing in the hallway outside her office before she could put her phone back in her pocket. He wrote, "I never stopped wondering if she knew, all those years, all that distance, that the first building I designed that I was truly proud of, I designed with her in mind. She had told me once that the most important thing about any space was that it should make the people inside it feel held. I never forgot that. I never built anything without thinking about it." Elena went back to her desk. She sat down. She looked at her screen without seeing it. She thought about her mother, Margaret and Elena Vasquez, school librarian, maker of tamales, keeper of a garden, lighter of a candle every October 9th, and she thought about the fact that somewhere in Boston there was a building, maybe more than one building, that had been designed with her mother's voice in it. With her mother's belief about what spaces should do for the people inside them. She thought about all the people who had walked into that building over the years, people who had no idea, people who had simply walked through a door and felt, without knowing why, that the space around them was somehow welcoming, somehow warm, somehow built by someone who understood what it meant to be held. She thought her mother would have found this unbearably beautiful. She thought she would have laughed first, because Margaret always laughed at things she found unbearably beautiful, as if beauty of a certain intensity required something to offset it. And then she would have cried. And then she would have made tea. They wrote back and forth for 2 months. Not frequently, once every week or 10 days, letters of moderate length, careful and considered in the way of 2 people who are navigating something delicate and have agreed, without explicitly saying so, to navigate it slowly and with care. Elena told him about her mother's life, about the library career and the garden and the tamales and the children and the 38 years in the Sacramento house. She told him the small things that she understood he would want to know, that Margaret had been happy, genuinely happy, that her life had been full and her children had been loved, and that she had faced her illness with a dignity and a patience that had left everyone who witnessed it permanently changed. She told him that she had lit candles. She described it carefully, without drama, and she let him sit with it. He wrote back, in that letter, more than he had written in any previous one. He wrote about what it meant to learn that he had been remembered that specifically, that consistently, across that many years. He wrote about it with great honesty, admitting that it both moved him and complicated him, that it made him feel the weight of time in a new way, the way learning something like that does when you are 67 years old and the years between you and the person who remembered you are years you cannot go back through. He said, "I think I spent a long time telling myself that what happened between us was just the incompleteness of young love, something real but not durable, not the kind of thing that was meant to last. Learning that she remembered me the way she did, I don't know that it changes anything, practically. But it changes something." Elena found, over those 2 months of letters, that she liked Thomas Calloway. This surprised her in a way she hadn't anticipated. She had expected the correspondence to feel strange or heavy or loaded with a meaning she couldn't metabolize, and it was some of those things, but it was also unexpectedly natural. He was thoughtful and direct and genuinely interested in who she was as a person separate from her role as the daughter of the woman he had once loved. He asked about her work and her life with real curiosity and listened to what she said with the same quality of attention that her mother had apparently noticed across a library table in 1979. He was funny in the dry, quiet way of people who know how to be funny without announcing that they are being funny. She told her sister Sophie about the letters and Sophie said, "Elena, you are essentially pen pals with your mom's first love," and Elena had laughed for longer than she had laughed in months, which had felt like its own kind of grace. She had told Sophie what he had said about the building, about designing it with Margaret's voice in it, about the idea that the most important thing about any space is that it should make the people inside it feel held, and Sophie had been quiet for a moment and then said, "That's Mom, isn't it?" "That's exactly Mom. She said that to me once about the library. She said the whole point of the library was that everyone who walked through the door should feel like they were supposed to be there." In January, 3 months after the first email, Thomas Calloway asked if Elena would be willing to meet. Not for any particular reason he articulated beyond wanting to meet the person he had been corresponding with, wanting to give the conversation a physical dimension that letters, even good letters, couldn't fully supply. He said he would understand completely if she felt it was not the right thing and that he would not press if she declined. She thought about it for 4 days. She called Ruth in Fresno and told her about the correspondence, and Ruth was quiet for a moment and then said, "What does your gut tell you?" And Elena said, "My gut tells me that my mother left that drawer open because she wanted something to be completed that she never got to complete herself." And Ruth said, "Then you already have your answer." They met in Sacramento. Elena's choice, she had wanted it to be her mother's city, her mother's ground. He flew out from Boston on a Thursday in February and they met at a cafe not far from the university where Margaret and Thomas had first spoken across a library table 44 years earlier. Elena arrived first and sat at a window table and watched him come through the door, and she recognized him from his website photograph, and she stood up and they shook hands, and then, after a pause that lasted only a second but felt like it contained something vast, they both sat down. They talked for 3 hours. She had brought the letter, her mother's letter, the original, in its cream envelope, and she had placed it on the table between them without quite deciding to, and he had looked at it for a long time without touching it, and then he had asked, very quietly, if he could read it. She said yes. She looked out the window at the street while he read. The oak trees along the sidewalk were bare in February, the branches making their precise and complicated patterns against the gray California sky. When she looked back at him, he was holding the last page and his eyes were wet, and he was not trying to hide it. He said, "She wrote well." Elena said, "She always did." Thomas Calloway flew back to Boston that Friday evening. Elena drove back to her hotel through the Sacramento streets in the February dark, past her mother's house. She had not been able to sell it yet, was not ready to sell it yet, was paying the bills on an empty house because she needed it to still exist for a while longer, and she sat in the parked car in front of it for a few minutes with the engine off, looking at the dark windows and the vegetable garden in the side yard that was bare and waiting for spring. She thought about all the mornings her mother had moved through that house. All the candles. All the October 9 THS. All the years of a life built with love and tended with devotion and lived with a wholeness that had included, quietly and permanently, a private room that belonged to no one but Margaret herself. She did not feel angry. She had wondered, reading the letter for the first time, if she would feel angry, if she would feel that her mother had kept something from her that she should have been given. She did not. What she felt instead was something closer to awe. Awe at the capacity of a person to love in multiple registers simultaneously, to love the life you have chosen and to honor a memory that predates it, to hold both things with integrity and without letting one diminish the other. Her mother had done that. For 40 years. Without anyone seeing it. Without asking for recognition. With complete consistency and complete privacy and complete love in every direction. She kept the letter. She did not put it back in the drawer. She does not believe in locked drawers anymore, she told her sister Sophie, and Sophie had understood what she meant. She keeps it in a cedar box on her nightstand, alongside a small photograph she found tucked into the letter's envelope, a photograph she had not noticed the first night, which had slipped down behind the rosary and which she only found when she went through the envelope more carefully several days later. It was a photograph of two young people sitting on the steps of a building she did not recognize, their shoulders almost touching, both of them squinting into the sun and laughing at something that had happened a moment before the shutter clicked and was now gone forever except as the cause of two young people's laughter in a photograph from 1980. The young woman had Margaret's face. The young man had gray eyes and kind lines around them even then. Elena looked at that photograph for a long time. She thought about the light through the oak trees that had looked, to a 23-year-old student, the same as it had 1,000 years ago and would look 1,000 years from now, and about two people who had happened to be the ones sitting there that day. She thought there was something right about the fact that this photograph had survived, that it had been kept this carefully, this long, in a locked drawer that had been unlocked at the end. She thought her mother had wanted it to survive. She thought her mother had wanted someone to see it and understand that this had been real, that it had happened, that two young people had sat on some steps in the California sun in 1980 and laughed at something together and that this was worth remembering. Worth keeping. Worth the candle. And here is what Elena will tell you, if you ask her now, 2 years after the night she opened that drawer. She will tell you that finding her mother's letter did not change who her mother was. Margaret Vasquez was still the woman who made tamales at Christmas and knew every child's favorite book and stayed late and cried every June and held her family together through the loss of a husband and the long decline of her own body with grace and love and absolute refusal to let the people she loved carry more than they needed to carry. She was still all of that. She was still the fixed point of Elena's universe, still the first person she wanted to call when something good happened or something hard happened or something she didn't understand happened. Finding the letter did not diminish any of that. What it did was add to it. It added a room. A room Elena had not known was there, inside the house of her mother's life, a room with high ceilings and good light, to use the words of the man who had once loved Margaret first and had designed his buildings with her voice in them for 40 years. That room was Margaret's. It will always be Margaret's. But Elena has been allowed, because of a drawer that was left unlocked at the right time, to stand at the threshold of it. To look in. To understand that her mother was more than anyone had been able to see. And to love her, if this is possible, if love has further rooms even in grief, even more than she did before. This is what we do not say enough about the people we lose. We talk about who they were to us. We talk about how they made us feel, how they shaped us, what we carry of them. We almost never talk about who they were to themselves, about the private, interior, unreachable life that belongs entirely to them and ends when they end and goes with them into whatever comes after. We almost never account for the vastness of another person's inner world, the stories they told only to themselves, the loves they kept quietly, the rooms they furnished with memories we were never invited into. Margaret Vasquez had such a room. Most people do. And the great privilege of Elena's grief, the gift inside the loss, the light inside the drawer, was that she got to find out. She got to know. She got to understand that her mother's life was not the size of the life she had been shown. It was larger. It was so much larger. And it was, from the first conversation beside a library window to the letter written 4 years before the end, lit throughout by the particular, stubborn, unkillable light of a love that had been real. Some things are too real to throw away. Even after 40 years. Even when you never send them. They stay in the drawer. They wait. And when the time is right, the drawer opens. And everything that was kept becomes, finally, known. If this story moved you tonight, if somewhere in Margaret's quiet keeping or Elena's 2 a.m. phone call or Thomas's 40 years of buildings designed to make people feel held, you recognized something true about the people you love and the lives they lived before you knew them, then leave a comment below and tell us. Tell us what you are thinking right now. Tell us if this reminds you of someone. Tell us if you have ever found something that changed the way you understood a person you thought you knew completely. Because those stories matter. Every single one of them matters. And on this channel, we believe that the stories that live in the quiet places, in the locked drawers, in the unsent letters, in the candles that burn every year on a birthday no one else knows to mark, are the stories most worth telling. Before you go, we would love to know where you are watching from tonight. Drop your city or your country in the comments. We read every single one, and it means more than you know to understand how far these stories travel. If you are not yet subscribed to Letters Never Sent, please take a moment and subscribe now so you never miss a story. We have more coming. Stories that will find you at exactly the right time. Stories that will stay with you long after the screen goes dark. Thank you for being here tonight. Thank you for listening all the way to the end. This story was for your mother, and for your grandmother, and for every person you have ever loved who was carrying something beautiful and private that you never got to see. They were larger than you knew. They were all so much larger than any of us knew.